The sky had turned the color of an open wound, and Gertrude Bristol could taste ash on her tongue as she stood in her stirrups and screamed at 800 head of terrified longhorns to move faster than fire itself. "Bernard, the ravine is closing. We have maybe 10 minutes before that wall of flame jumps the gap." Bernard Fairchild's horse reared beneath him, eyes rolling white with terror, smoke pouring across the Texas panhandle in a thick orange curtain that ate the horizon whole. Behind them, 3,000 acres of dry summer grass had become a living monster, and it was hunting them. "There is no way through, Gertrude. We are trapped between the fire and the canyon wall." "There is a way," she shouted back, wheeling her mare around so hard the animal nearly stumbled. "But you are going to have to trust me completely, and I mean completely, Bernard Fairchild, because if you hesitate for even 1 second, every man and every animal on this drive dies tonight." He stared at her through the smoke. This woman he had known for only 6 weeks. This woman his own father had warned him never to fully trust because she was a Bristol, and the Bristols had a secret that could ruin the Fairchild name forever. But there was no time for secrets now. There was only fire, and a woman who rode like she had been born from lightning itself, and the terrible, thunderous forced choice pressing down on both their chests. "I trust you," he said, and the words tasted like a confession he did not know he was making. "Lead them, Gertrude. Lead them wherever you have to." She did not smile. There was no time for smiles. She simply turned her mare toward a wall of mesquite brush that looked, to any ordinary cattleman, like solid, impassable thicket, and she drove her heels into the horse's flanks. "Hidden River," she screamed over her shoulder. "My father found it 30 years ago and no one else knows it exists. Ride, Bernard. Ride like your life depends on it, because it does." And that was the moment Bernard Fairchild understood, with the flames roaring at his back and cinders burning holes in his duster, that Gertrude Bristol was not the fragile rancher's daughter the gossiping women of Amarillo believed her to be. She was the only person standing between 300 cattle, 6 exhausted drovers, and certain death. 6 weeks earlier, Bernard Fairchild had ridden onto the Bristol ranch with nothing but a letter of introduction and a heart full of resentment he did not fully understand yet. The year was 1878. And the cattle trails running north out of Texas toward the railheads in Kansas were choked with herds worth more money than most men would see in a lifetime. Bernard's father, Wallace Fairchild, owned one of the largest spreads in the Texas panhandle, and he had sent his only son south with strict instructions to negotiate a joint cattle drive with the neighboring Bristol Ranch, whose grazing land sat astride the only safe water route to the Kansas railheads that summer. "You will deal with old Amos Bristol directly," Wallace had told his son before he left. "Do not let that daughter of his talk you into anything foolish. I hear she thinks she runs the place." Bernard had laughed at the time. He pictured some spoiled rancher's daughter who liked to play at cattle work between piano lessons and needlepoint, the kind of woman who fainted at the sight of a rattlesnake and needed a man's strong arm to cross a muddy street. He was 28 years old, 6 feet 2 inches of hardened muscle built from a lifetime of branding calves and breaking wild mustangs, and he had precious little patience left for delicate Eastern manners dressed up in Western calico. He found Amos Bristol's ranch house at the base of a low mesa, a sprawling adobe and timber structure surrounded by corrals that stretched almost to the horizon. What he did not expect was to find the old man laid up in bed with a shattered hip, the result of a fall from a Greenbroke stallion 3 weeks prior, and utterly unable to ride the 600 miles to Dodge City that the coming cattle drive required. "My daughter will handle the negotiations," Amos wheezed from beneath a pile of quilts, his weathered face pale with pain and stubborn pride fighting each other for dominance. "Gertrude knows this land and these cattle better than any man I have ever hired, Fairchild. And if you cannot accept dealing with a woman as an equal partner in this venture, then you can ride back to your father and tell him the Bristol Ranch will find another buyer for its beef." Bernard had opened his mouth to argue, some half-formed protest about propriety and proper channels rising in his throat, when the bedroom door swung open and Gertrude Bristol walked into his life like a force of nature nobody had bothered to warn him about. She was not what he expected. She wore practical canvas trousers instead of skirts, a man's chambray work shirt with the sleeves rolled to her elbows, and her dark auburn hair was braided back tightly beneath a wide-brimmed hat that had clearly seen years of hard use under a punishing sun. Her hands, when she extended one to shake his, were calloused and strong, and her hazel eyes held a directness that made him feel, for one disorienting moment, as though she were assessing him the way a buyer assesses a horse before purchase. "Mr. Fairchild," she said, and her voice carried none of the simpering softness he had braced himself for. "I understand you are here to discuss joining our herds for the drive north. I should tell you now that I intend to ride with this drive myself, from start to finish, and if that arrangement does not suit you or your father, we can end this conversation immediately, and I will find another outfit willing to work alongside a woman who knows what she is doing." "Miss Bristol," Bernard said carefully, still recovering his footing, "with respect, a cattle drive of this size covering 600 miles is grueling work even for experienced hands. River crossings, stampedes, rustlers, weather. It is no place for a woman," she interrupted, one auburn eyebrow arching with dangerous precision. "Mr. Fairchild, I have been riding this range since I was 7 years old. I can rope a steer faster than any hand your father employs. I know every water source and every dry stretch between here and the Kansas border better than the maps your railroad surveyors have drawn, and I have personally overseen 3 cattle drives while my father recovered from previous injuries. If you would like proof of my capabilities before you insult me further, I would be happy to arrange a demonstration." Amos Bristol let out a wheezing laugh from his sickbed. "I would take her up on that, son, if I were you. My Gertrude does not make offers she cannot back up." There was something in the old man's eyes, though, some flicker of worry that crossed his face when he looked at his daughter, that Bernard would not understand the meaning of until much later, when secrets long buried finally clawed their way to the surface. Bernard, against every instinct his upbringing had instilled in him, found himself nodding. "All right, Miss Bristol, show me." They rode out to the corrals together, and Bernard watched in growing disbelief as Gertrude Bristol selected the meanest, most notoriously difficult longhorn steer in the entire herd, a massive brindle animal the hands had nicknamed Lucifer for his habit of goring anyone foolish enough to enter his pen. Without hesitation, without a single wasted motion, she vaulted the corral fence, uncoiled her lariat with a practiced flick of her wrist, and had the animal roped, thrown, and hog-tied in under 90 seconds, all while Bernard stood frozen at the fence rail with his mouth slightly open. She stood over the subdued steer, breathing hard but grinning with an unmistakable fierce satisfaction, and looked back at Bernard with an expression that dared him to find fault with what he had just witnessed. "Well, Mr. Fairchild, shall we discuss the terms of this joint drive now, or would you like me to demonstrate my skill with a branding iron as well?" Something shifted in Bernard's chest in that moment, some old certainty cracking apart to reveal an unfamiliar and unwelcome admiration underneath. He had never in his life seen a woman handle a wild animal with such fearless, technical precision. He had rarely seen a man do it either. "That will not be necessary, Miss Bristol," he said, and he meant it as both surrender and compliment. "I believe we have a great deal to discuss." The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of preparation. The Fairchild and Bristol herds would be combined into a single massive drive, nearly 2,000 head total, pushed north along the western branch of the Kishom Trail toward the railhead at Dodge City, where Kansas beef buyers were paying premium prices that summer due to a shortage caused by drought further north. It was an enormous undertaking requiring careful coordination between the 2 ranch outfits, and despite his initial reservations, Bernard found himself increasingly reliant upon, and increasingly fascinated by, Gertrude Bristol's uncanny knowledge of the land. She could read weather in the color of the western sky with an accuracy that put the almanac to shame. She knew which creek beds would hold water even in the driest months, and which looked deceptively promising, but would leave a herd stranded and thirsty. She had memorized the migration patterns of the buffalo herds that still roamed portions of the Indian Territory, understanding instinctively how to route the cattle drive to avoid the worst of the competition for grazing land. But it was her relationship with the cattle themselves that most unsettled and impressed Bernard. She seemed to understand the herd's collective moods the way a mother understands an infant's cries, sensing the subtle shift in body language that preceded a stampede minutes before the more experienced drovers noticed anything amiss. 3 times in the first 2 weeks of the drive, her early warnings prevented what could have been catastrophic losses. "How do you know these things?" Bernard asked her one evening as they sat near the chuck wagon fire, the rest of the drovers already asleep in their bedrolls after a long day pushing the herd across the sun-baked plains of the Indian Territory. Gertrude was cleaning her Winchester rifle with the same meticulous care she seemed to bring to every task, and she did not look up immediately from her work. "My mother died when I was 6 years old," she said finally. "Consumption. After that, my father did not have the money or the inclination to send me east to some finishing school to learn embroidery and French, so he taught me everything he knew instead: how to read cattle, how to read weather, how to read men, for that matter, though I confess that particular skill has proven less reliable than the others." There was a guardedness in the way she said it, a wall going up behind her eyes that told Bernard there was more to the story than she was willing to share, but he did not push. "Not yet. My father wanted a son," she continued after a moment, her hands still moving expertly over the rifle mechanism. "Instead, he got me. I think for a long time he resented that fact. But somewhere along the way, I believe he came to prefer having a daughter who could outride and outshoot every ranch hand in the county, over a son who might have simply inherited the land without ever truly understanding it. I do not think any man could look at what you accomplished with that steer and feel anything but pride," Bernard said quietly, and he watched something soften in her expression, just for a moment, before the careful mask slid back into place. "You are kinder than your reputation suggested, Bernard Fairchild," she said. "The men in Amarillo speak of Wallace Fairchild's son as though you were cut from the same hard, unforgiving cloth as your father." Bernard felt an old, familiar tightness in his chest at the mention of his father. "My father believes that sentiment is a weakness that cannot be afforded on the frontier. He built the Fairchild Ranch from nothing, and he did it by treating every decision, every relationship, as a transaction to be won or lost. I sometimes worry that I have inherited more of his coldness than I would like." "I do not believe that," Gertrude said, and there was something in her voice, some quiet certainty, that made his heart beat strangely fast. "A cold man would not have swallowed his pride the way you did on that first day, admitting a woman could outride him. A cold man would have ridden back to his father in a rage, rather than staying to see what I could truly do." They sat in comfortable silence after that, the fire crackling between them, the vast Kansas prairie stretching dark and star-strewn in every direction. And Bernard found himself thinking that this was perhaps the first genuinely honest conversation he had shared with another human being in longer than he cared to admit. But even as their friendship deepened through the long weeks of the drive, there remained a secret coiled beneath the surface of the Bristol family history, one that neither Amos nor Gertrude had spoken of, and one that would soon come crashing into the open with devastating consequences. The drive had been moving steadily north for nearly a month when Bernard first noticed the strange behavior of one of his father's hired hands, a lean, hard-eyed drover named Silas Crow who had joined the outfit at his father's specific insistence, ostensibly to help manage the combined herds, but who seemed, upon closer observation, to spend an inordinate amount of time watching Gertrude rather than watching the cattle. It was Gertrude herself who first raised the alarm, finding Bernard alone near the remuda one evening while the rest of the camp settled in for supper. "Bernard, I need to speak with you about something, and I need you to listen without becoming defensive, because I believe what I am about to tell you concerns your father directly." Bernard felt a cold weight settle in his stomach. "Go on." "That man your father sent, Silas Crow. I caught him this afternoon going through my saddlebags while I was helping Cookie repair a wheel on the chuck wagon. When I confronted him, he claimed he was looking for a missing branding iron, but, Bernard, there was no reason for him to be anywhere near my gear in the first place. And this is not the first strange thing I have noticed. He has been asking the other hands questions about my father, about old debts, about land surveys from years back. I do not think he is here simply to help drive cattle." Bernard's jaw tightened. "What are you suggesting?" "I am suggesting that your father may have sent him to spy on my family, or worse, to search for something specific. And I think it has to do with a piece of land dispute that happened between our fathers nearly 20 years ago, before either of us were old enough to understand it." This was the first Bernard had heard of any such dispute, and the revelation struck him like a physical blow. "What land dispute?" Gertrude hesitated, and for the first time since he had met her, Bernard saw genuine uncertainty cross her normally composed features. "I do not know the full details. My father has never spoken of it directly, only in fragments, in moments of anger or drink. But I know it involves the water rights to Cottonwood Creek, the very creek that runs through the northern boundary of both our properties. And I know that whatever happened, it left a bitterness between our families that neither of them has ever fully explained to us." Bernard thought of his father's warning before he left for the Bristol ranch, the strange insistence that Bernard not let Gertrude talk him into anything foolish, the barely concealed tension whenever the Bristol name came up in conversation at the Fairchild dinner table. Pieces he had never thought to question before suddenly seemed to demand new scrutiny. "I will speak with Crow," Bernard said finally. "And when we reach Dodge City, I intend to write to my father and demand a full explanation. Gertrude, I promise you, whatever hidden motive exists between our families, I will not let it be used as a weapon against you or your father." She looked at him for a long moment, her hazel eyes searching his face with an intensity that made him feel simultaneously exposed and treasured. "Why does this matter so much to you, Bernard? You barely knew me 2 months ago." "I am not entirely certain," he admitted, and it was the truth. "But it does matter. You matter, more than I think either of us anticipated when this drive began." The confrontation with Silas Crow came sooner than either of them expected, and it came with violence. 2 nights later, as the drive camped along the banks of a shallow tributary somewhere in the vast emptiness of the Indian Territory, Bernard woke to the sound of raised voices near the horse picket line. He grabbed his revolver and moved quickly through the darkness toward the commotion, arriving just in time to see Silas Crow with a hand clamped roughly over Gertrude's mouth, dragging her away from the camp toward a waiting horse. "Let her go," Bernard said, his voice low and dangerous, his revolver already leveled at Crow's chest. Crow's eyes darted between Bernard and his captive, calculating odds. "This does not concern you, Fairchild. Your father wants what your father wants, and this woman's family has been sitting on something that belongs to him for 20 years. What are you talking about? Ask her father about the deed, boy. Ask him about the survey papers he stole from your grandfather before either of us were born. The Bristols have been squatting on Fairchild water rights for 2 decades, and your father sent me to find the proof." Gertrude, despite the hand over her mouth, managed to drive her elbow backward into Crow's ribs with enough force to make him grunt in pain and loosen his grip just slightly. It was all the opening she needed. She twisted free, dropped low, and swept his legs out from under him with a maneuver that spoke of years of practical self-defense training that Bernard suspected her father had insisted upon for a daughter growing up largely alone on a remote frontier ranch. Crow hit the ground hard, and before he could recover, Gertrude had her own belt knife pressed against his throat, her knee planted firmly in his chest. "You will tell me everything you know about this deed," she said, her voice steady despite the adrenaline surely coursing through her, "or I will let Bernard's bullet finish what my knife started." By the time the rest of the camp had roused and gathered around the scene, lanterns held aloft against the darkness, Sela's crow had confessed everything. Wallace Fairchild had indeed sent him on this drive with secret instruction to search Amos Bristol's belongings for a set of original survey documents that Crow claimed proved the Bristol family's claim to the Cottonwood Creek water rights had been obtained through fraud, using forged signatures on a land transfer document decades earlier, back when both patriarchs had been young men first staking their claims on the frontier. "Your father believes recovering those documents will allow him to reclaim the water rights and potentially the land itself," Crow said, wincing as two of the other drovers bound his hands with rope. "He offered me a substantial bonus if I could locate them before this drive concluded." Bernard felt sick with a complicated mixture of anger and shame. He looked at Gertrude, whose face had gone pale and rigid with the weight of this revelation. "I never knew," he said quietly. "Gertrude, I swear to you, I had no idea my father was capable of this kind of betrayal, using me, using this cattle drive, as cover for some hidden scheme against your family." "I believe you," she said, and despite everything, despite the dark past now unearthed between their families, there was no accusation in her voice, only a weary sadness. "But this changes things, Bernard. If your father is willing to go to these lengths to send a man to steal from us, to potentially destroy my father's claim to land he has worked his entire life, I do not know how our families can continue this partnership." "Then we will finish this drive as partners in truth, regardless of what our fathers have done," Bernard said fiercely. "I will not let his sins become an excuse to abandon what we have built here, Gertrude. Whatever happens between our families over that old dispute, it does not have to determine what happens between us." She looked at him for a long moment, and in her eyes he saw the flicker of something he desperately hoped was the beginning of trust rebuilding itself from the wreckage of this revelation. They tied Sela's crow to a tree for the remainder of the night and dispatched two of the more trustworthy hands to escort him back toward the nearest town at first light, to be handed over to whatever passed for law enforcement in that stretch of the territory, along with a written account of his attempted assault and theft. But the danger, they would soon discover, was far from over. The drama between their fathers had merely been the first storm cloud on a horizon that was about to darken considerably further, in ways that would test every ounce of skill and courage Gertrude Bristol possessed. The drive pushed onward through the sweltering heat of July, the days blending together in an endless rhythm of dust and lowing cattle, and the constant vigilance required to keep 2,000 head of longhorns moving in a single, manageable direction. Bernard found his admiration for Gertrude deepening with each passing day, not merely for her technical skill, but for the quiet strength with which she carried the burden of her father's illness, managing correspondence with Amos through letters carried by riders sent back and forth to the ranch, making decisions that would have paralyzed lesser men with doubt. It was during the third week of August, as the drive crossed into the drier grasslands of the western Indian Territory, approaching the Kansas border, that Bernard first noticed the change in the air, a peculiar stillness that seemed to press down on the entire landscape like a held breath. Gertrude noticed it too, and her expression grew increasingly troubled as the day wore on. "There is a wildfire somewhere to the south," she said that evening, studying the horizon where a faint orange glow was beginning to bleed into the twilight sky. "I have seen this before, Bernard. The way the light changes, the way the animals grow restless. We need to consider our options carefully. How far away do you estimate the fire to be?" 10 miles, perhaps 12, but that estimate means very little in this kind of drought. The grass out here is tinder dry, and if the wind shifts in our direction, That fire could cover 10 miles in less time than it takes to break camp and saddle every horse we own. The camp that night was tense with barely suppressed fear. Bernard organized watches to monitor the fire's progress, and by midnight, it had become horrifyingly clear that Gertrude's warning had been prescient. The wind had indeed shifted, pushing the wall of flame directly toward their position. And worse, the terrain ahead offered a cruel trap, a narrow canyon formation that channeled between two ridges before opening onto the final approach to the river crossing that would lead them safely into Kansas territory. If we try to outrun the fire along our planned route, we will be funneled directly into that canyon, Gertrude explained to Bernard and the assembled drovers, spreading a hand-drawn map across the tailgate of the chuck wagon by lantern light. The canyon walls are too steep for the cattle to climb, and the far end connects to open plains, but the fire is moving fast enough that it could seal that exit before we ever reach it. We would be trapped between flame and stone with nowhere to go. Then what is our alternative? One of the older drovers asked, his voice tight with barely controlled panic. There is no other route through this stretch of territory that I know of, not one that could accommodate a herd this size. Gertrude's eyes met Bernard's across the lantern light, and he saw something there that both thrilled and terrified him. Absolute, unshakable determination. There is another way, she said, but it is not one that appears on any map your surveyors have drawn, and I have only told one other living person about its existence. The story she told them then, as the distant fire glow grew brighter with each passing hour, was one that reached back into her father's own frontier past. Nearly 30 years earlier, as a young man exploring the territory before it had been mapped by any official survey, Amos Bristol had discovered a hidden river channel that cut beneath the very ridge that formed one wall of the dangerous canyon. The river had carved a natural passage through what appeared, from the surface, to be solid rock, but which in fact contained a wide, shallow ford accessible through a narrow gap in the mesquite brush that most travelers would dismiss as impassable thicket. My father used this passage exactly twice in his life, Gertrude explained. Once when he was young and exploring, and once nearly 15 years ago when a similar wildfire threatened one of our own smaller herds. He showed me the location when I was 12 years old, made me memorize every landmark, every turn in case I ever needed it myself. I have never had occasion to use that knowledge until tonight. Can you find it again, after all this time? Bernard asked, and there was no doubt in his voice. Only the desperate hope of a man who had come to trust this woman's abilities more completely than he had ever trusted anyone in his life. I can find it, Gertrude said, and her voice carried an iron certainty that steadied the fraying nerves of every drover gathered around that lantern. But we will need to move immediately, and every single person on this drive will need to follow my instructions without hesitation, without question, and without fear clouding their judgment. The margin for error will be measured in minutes, not hours. They broke camp within the hour, the drovers working with the grim efficiency of men who understood that their lives depended on speed. The cattle, already unsettled by the smell of smoke now carrying clearly on the shifting wind, proved difficult to move in the darkness, and it took every ounce of skill the combined outfit possessed to keep the herd from scattering into a full stampede that could have doomed them all before the fire ever arrived. By dawn, the situation had become desperate. The wildfire had grown into a monstrous wall of flame visible for miles, consuming the dry grassland with a speed that defied every prediction the experienced drovers had made the night before. The wind, cruel and capricious, had shifted twice more, each time seeming to conspire specifically to funnel the fire directly toward the fleeing cattle drive. This was the moment, as the sky turned the color of an open wound and cinders began raining down like a plague of fiery locusts, that Gertrude Bristol stood in her stirrups and screamed at 800 head of terrified longhorns to move faster than fire itself. The moment that had opened this very story, The moment when Bernard Fairchild finally understood the true depth of the woman riding beside him. "There is a way," she had shouted, wheeling her mare around. "But you are going to have to trust me completely, and I mean completely, Bernard Fairchild, because if you hesitate for even 1 second, every man and every animal on this drive dies tonight." Now, with the flames roaring closer and the mesquite thicket looming ahead like an impossible wall, Bernard watched Gertrude Bristol do something that would remain seared into his memory for the rest of his life. She rode directly at the seemingly impassable brush, not slowing, not hesitating, and at the last possible moment her mare found a narrow gap invisible to anyone who had not been specifically taught its location, and she disappeared through the thicket as though swallowed by the earth itself. "Follow her!" Bernard bellowed to the drovers, and he spurred his own horse forward, driving the lead cattle toward the gap Gertrude had vanished through. What lay beyond that thicket defied every expectation Bernard had formed during his years working the Texas range. The ground fell away in a gentle slope, revealing a wide, shallow river channel that ran between two rocky embankments, invisible from above and completely shielded from the approaching fire by the very ridge that had seemed, moments before, to be an impenetrable death trap. The water glinted silver in the growing dawn light, wide enough to accommodate the entire herd moving in loose formation, deep enough to provide a natural fire break that no amount of wind-driven flame could cross. "Move them into the water," Gertrude shouted, already positioned at the far bank, directing the lead cattle with expert precision as they splashed into the cool, shallow current. "The fire cannot follow us here. Keep them moving, keep them calm. We need every single animal across before the smoke gets thick enough to cause a panic." For the next desperate hour, Bernard worked alongside Gertrude and the exhausted drovers, pushing, coaxing, and driving nearly 2,000 head of cattle through the hidden river channel, while the wildfire raged along the ridge above them, close enough that they could feel its terrible heat radiating down into the canyon, close enough that the roar of the flames drowned out even the frightened bellowing of the herd. Twice, burning debris cascaded down the embankment, and twice, quick-thinking drovers extinguished the small fires before they could catch on the dry brush lining the riverbank. Through it all, Gertrude Bristol remained the calm, unshakable center around which the entire desperate operation revolved. She seemed to be everywhere at once, catching a panicking calf before it could bolt back toward the flames, redirecting confused drovers toward safer paths through the water, calling out constant reassurance and instruction with a voice that never once cracked under the tremendous pressure bearing down on all of them. By the time the last of the cattle had crossed safely to the far side of the hidden river, emerging onto a wide grassy plain that the fire, blocked by the water and the natural rock formation, could not reach, the sun had fully risen, casting long golden light across a landscape that had, hours before, seemed destined for complete devastation. The exhausted drovers collapsed onto the riverbank, coughing from smoke inhalation but alive, every single man accounted for, and remarkably, every single head of cattle successfully saved from what should have been an inevitable catastrophe. Bernard found Gertrude standing alone at the water's edge, watching the distant fire finally begin to burn itself out against the natural firebreak of the river valley, her shoulders shaking slightly with the delayed release of tension that came after surviving something truly terrible. "You saved us," he said quietly, coming to stand beside her. "Every single one of us. I have never in my life witnessed anything like what you accomplished tonight, Gertrude. Your knowledge, your courage, your absolute mastery of this land, it was nothing short of extraordinary." She turned to look at him, and he saw tears mixing with the soot and dust on her weathered face. "I was terrified, Bernard. The entire time, I was terrified that I would misremember something my father taught me, that the passage would have changed in the years since he last used it, that I would lead everyone into that canyon only to discover the way through had collapsed or flooded or simply never existed at all outside of a young girl's memory. "But you did not hesitate," Bernard said, reaching out to gently wipe a streak of soot from her cheek, his fingers lingering perhaps a moment longer than propriety strictly demanded. "Even terrified, you let us through. That is not the absence of fear, Gertrude. That is courage in its truest form, the willingness to act decisively even when you carry doubt in your own heart." She looked up at him then, and something passed between them in that moment, something that had been building silently through 6 weeks of shared hardship and growing respect, something that neither of them could deny any longer. "Bernard," she said softly, "I need to tell you something, and I need you to understand that I am not simply speaking from the exhaustion of this terrible night. Tell me. When you told me, back before all of this began, that you would not let your father's schemes determine what happens between us, I did not fully believe you. I have spent so many years being disappointed by men who claim to respect my abilities only to later reveal that their respect was conditional, that it evaporated the moment I proved inconvenient to their plans or their pride. But watching you tonight, watching the way you trusted me completely, without hesitation, without needing to assert some masculine authority over decisions that were rightfully mine to make, I find that I have come to trust you in return. Completely." Bernard felt his heart swell, with an emotion so powerful it nearly stole the breath from his lungs. "Gertrude Bristol, I think I have been falling in love with you since the moment I watched you throw that steer in your father's corral, though it has taken me this entire drive, and very nearly dying in a wildfire, to fully understand what that feeling meant." "Bernard," she whispered, and then his lips found hers, gentle at first, tentative with the newness of admission, and then deepening into something fierce and certain as the exhausted drovers cheered somewhere behind them, having witnessed the entire exchange with the particular delight that hardworking men reserve for genuine romance blooming amid hardship. They stood there at the edge of the hidden river, ash still drifting down around them like strange gray snow, the surviving herd grazing peacefully on the grassy plain beyond. And for the first time since this treacherous cattle drive had begun, Gertrude Bristol allowed herself to believe that perhaps happiness was not the impossible, foolish dream she had long ago convinced herself it must be for a woman like her. But their joy, however hard-won and richly deserved, would soon be tested once more by the unresolved conflict between their fathers, a conflict that had merely been delayed by the wildfire's terrible interruption, not extinguished. The drive reached Dodge City 8 days later, considerably behind schedule, but with remarkably few losses given the catastrophe they had narrowly escaped. The cattle buyers, initially skeptical of a herd that arrived with visible smoke damage to hooves and hide, quickly changed their tune when Bernard and Gertrude explained the circumstances of their survival, and word spread rapidly through the cattle town that the Fairchild-Bristol combined drive had accomplished something nearly miraculous in escaping the wildfire that had, according to reports from other outfits, claimed several smaller herds in the surrounding territory. The prices they received for the surviving cattle exceeded even their most optimistic projections, the beef buyers eager to pay premium rates for healthy animals in a market suddenly tightened by the fire's destruction of competing herds. It was, by any objective financial measure, an enormously successful drive. But success in commerce could not erase the shadow of Wallace Fairchild's betrayal, and Bernard knew that a reckoning with his father was now unavoidable. He wrote to Wallace immediately upon reaching Dodge City, a letter that took him 3 attempts to compose properly, his anger and disappointment warring with a lifetime of filial obligation that made outright condemnation of his own father feel like a betrayal of some deeper, older loyalty. "Father, I have learned of Silas Crow's true purpose on this drive, and of the accusations he made regarding the Cottonwood Creek water rights and a supposedly forged land transfer document from decades ago. I demand a full and honest accounting of what truly transpired between yourself and Amos Bristol, and I demand it before I return home, because I cannot in good conscience continue any relationship, business or otherwise, with a father who would use deception and theft as his preferred method of resolving old disputes. The reply, when it finally arrived nearly 3 weeks later, delivered by a rider who had followed their return trail south, was not the letter Bernard had expected. It was not defensive, not full of the cold justifications he had braced himself to receive. Instead, it read like the confession of a man finally confronting decades of buried guilt. Bernard, your mother always told me that the debts we refuse to settle in this life have a way of returning to collect themselves regardless of our wishes, and I fear that time has finally come for me. The truth is more complicated and more shameful than perhaps even Crow understood when I sent him on that misguided errand. 20 years ago, Amos Bristol and I were partners, not rivals, in the original survey of the land that would become our 2 ranches. We split the claim between us as brothers might, trusting each other completely, as young men on the frontier often must when there is no established law to enforce agreements beyond a handshake and a shared word of honor. But when the official survey documents were finally filed with the territorial government, a clerical error, or perhaps a deliberate manipulation by a land agent seeking his own profit, I have never been entirely certain which, granted the more valuable Cottonwood Creek water rights entirely to Amos, leaving my own claim with significantly less reliable access to water. I was young and prideful, and instead of addressing the error honestly with my former friend, I allowed my resentment to fester for 2 decades, convincing myself over the years that Amos had somehow orchestrated the error deliberately for his own benefit, though I have no actual evidence this was ever true. When you departed for the Bristol Ranch to negotiate this drive, old wounds reopened, and I made the shameful decision to send Crow to search for proof of what I had convinced myself was fraud, hoping perhaps to finally reclaim what I believed my family had been unjustly denied. I was wrong to do this, Bernard. I was wrong to let 2 decades of assumed grievance justify theft and deception against a man who was once my closest friend. If you have found happiness with Amos Bristol's daughter, as I suspect from the tone and length of your letters that you may have, then I would consider it the greatest fortune of my life to see our 2 families finally reconciled, rather than continuing this foolish, decades-old feud that has cost us both far more than any water rights ever could. Bernard read the letter 3 times, sitting alone in the small hotel room he had taken in Dodge City, while the final business of selling the cattle was concluded, and when he finished, he found his eyes unexpectedly wet with tears he had not anticipated shedding for his father's belated honesty. He brought the letter immediately to Gertrude, who read it in the small parlor of the boarding house where she had taken a room, her expression cycling through disbelief, anger, and finally something like cautious relief as she absorbed the full weight of what it revealed. 20 years, she said softly, when she had finished reading. 20 years of silence and assumed betrayal, when a single honest conversation might have prevented all of this pain, all of this danger that Crow's actions nearly brought down upon our drive. I want to make this right, Bernard said. Not just for our fathers, though I do believe they deserve the chance to finally reconcile after all these years of foolish pride, but for us, Gertrude, I do not want any shadow of this old feud hanging over whatever future we might build together. What are you proposing? I am proposing that we return to Texas together, that we bring my father's letter directly to yours, and that we insist, both of us, that this reconciliation happen properly, honestly, with full transparency about what occurred and full acknowledgement of the wrong that was done. And then, he paused, his heart suddenly hammering with a nervousness that felt entirely disproportionate to a man who had just faced down a raging wildfire. And then, if your father consents, and if you will have me, I am proposing marriage, Gertrude Bristol. I love you more than I ever believed myself capable of loving another person, and I do not wish to spend one more day of my life without you beside me." Gertrude stared at him for a long moment, and Bernard held his breath, suddenly terrified that he had moved too quickly, that the intensity of their shared trauma had created a false intimacy that would not survive the return to ordinary life. But then she smiled, a smile that transformed her entire face with a warmth he had rarely seen her display so openly, and she crossed the small parlor to take both his hands in hers. "Bernard Fairchild, I have spent my entire life being told, in ways subtle and overt, that a woman with my particular skills and my particular independence was somehow unmarriageable, too difficult, too unwomanly, for any man to genuinely desire as a wife rather than simply respect as a ranch hand. You are the first man who has ever looked at my strength and seen something to love rather than something to fear or diminish. Yes. Yes, I will marry you, and yes, I believe with all my heart that we can heal what our fathers broke." They returned to Texas together in early September, the surviving proceeds from the successful cattle drive representing a substantial fortune for both families, more than enough to settle any lingering financial disputes over the water rights that had caused so much pain. The reunion between Wallace Fairchild and Amos Bristow, when it finally occurred at the Bristol Ranch house where Amos was slowly recovering from his hip injury, was tense at first. Two proud old men circling each other with the wariness of former friends uncertain how to bridge 2 decades of accumulated resentment. But Bernard's father, to his credit, spoke first, and spoke honestly, offering a full apology for both the original assumption of fraud and the more recent, more serious betrayal of sending Crow to steal documents rather than simply asking for an honest conversation about the old dispute. Amos, for his part, revealed that he had long suspected the water rights discrepancy had been an honest clerical error rather than deliberate theft, but that his own stubborn pride had prevented him from ever raising the issue directly with Wallace, fearing it would be seen as an accusation rather than a genuine attempt at clarification. "We have both been fools," Amos said finally, extending a weathered hand toward his old friend. 20 years wasted on assumed grievances that a single honest conversation could have resolved. I am glad, Wallace, more glad than I can properly express, that our children have shown more wisdom than we ever managed to display." The two old ranchers agreed to a formal resurvey of the disputed water rights, this time conducted jointly and transparently, with an understanding that regardless of the official outcome, both properties would maintain shared access to the Cottonwood Creek water source, a practical solution that honored the spirit of their original youthful partnership rather than the letter of a flawed legal document. The wedding of Bernard Fairchild and Gertrude Bristol took place in October, under a sky finally cleared of the smoke and haze that had plagued the region throughout that terrible summer of drought and wildfire. It was held on the grounds of the Bristol Ranch house, beneath a canopy of cottonwood trees that grew along the very creek whose water rights had caused so much pain and finally, so much healing between their two families. Gertrude wore a simple ivory dress that her mother had once worn, carefully preserved in a cedar chest for over 20 years, altered slightly to accommodate the fact that Gertrude, unlike her more delicate mother, possessed the strong, capable shoulders of a woman who had spent her entire life working alongside men, and outshining most of them in every practical skill the frontier demanded. Amos Bristow, still requiring a cane to walk following his hip injury, but refusing absolutely to be carried or wheeled to his daughter's wedding, gave her away with tears openly streaming down his weathered face, tears he made no effort to hide or apologize for. Wallace Fairchild stood beside his son as best man, and in a gesture that surprised everyone present, he presented Gertrude with a small leather-bound journal that had belonged to his own late wife, Bernard's mother, containing decades of careful notes about ranching, weather patterns, and cattle husbandry that she had compiled during her own years, helping to build the Fairchild Ranch from nothing. My wife would have admired you tremendously, Gertrude, Wallace said, his voice thick with an emotion that Bernard had rarely heard his stern father display. She always believed that the frontier demanded partnership between husband and wife, not mere subservience, and I confess I did not always honor that belief as fully as I should have during our marriage. I hope you and Bernard will build something better than what came before, something that honors both of your remarkable strengths equally. The ceremony itself was simple, conducted by a traveling minister who happened to be passing through the region. But the vows Bernard and Gertrude exchanged carried a weight and sincerity that spoke to everything they had survived together. From the initial skeptical negotiation over cattle drive terms, to the terrifying flight through fire and water that had finally revealed the true depth of their feelings for each other. Gertrude Bristow, Bernard said, his voice steady despite the emotion clearly visible in his eyes, I promise to never again underestimate your strength, your intelligence, or your capability, as I foolishly did when we first met. I promise to be your partner in every sense of that word, to trust your judgment as completely as I trusted it when you led us through fire toward that hidden river, and to spend every day of our life together grateful that I was fortunate enough to fall in love with a woman who needed no rescuing, only recognition of the extraordinary person she already was. Bernard Fairchild, Gertrude replied, her own voice carrying the fierce steadiness that had guided an entire cattle drive to safety through the worst wildfire the region had seen in a generation. I promise to never again doubt that a man could love me for my strength rather than despite it. I promise to be honest with you always, even when honesty is difficult, as I learned during this drive that hidden secrets and unspoken grievances cause far more damage than any honest confrontation ever could. And I promise to build a life with you that honors both our families' hard-won wisdom, a life where partnership means true equality, not mere tolerance of a wife's unusual talents. They kissed as husband and wife for the first time to enthusiastic applause from the assembled guests, which included not only their two reconciled families, but every single drover who had survived that terrible wildfire alongside them. Men who had become fiercely loyal to Gertrude after witnessing her extraordinary leadership firsthand, and who had traveled considerable distances to attend the wedding of the woman they now considered something between a respected boss and a beloved sister in arms. The reception that followed stretched long into the evening, with fiddle music and dancing, and enough barbecued beef to satisfy even the hardiest frontier appetites, courtesy of a small portion of the very cattle that Gertrude had led to safety through the hidden river months before. Bernard found himself pulled aside at one point by old Amos Bristol, who gripped his new son-in-law's arm with surprising strength for a man still recovering from serious injury. "You know," Amos said, his eyes twinkling with something between amusement and deep paternal satisfaction, "I was worried, when you first arrived at my ranch those months ago, that you would be like so many other men who came calling on my Gertrude over the years, men who saw her skills as a novelty to be admired from a distance but never truly respected as an equal partnership. Men who wanted a wife who would set aside her rope and her rifle once the wedding vows were spoken, expecting her to transform overnight into some delicate parlor decoration. I could never ask that of her," Bernard said honestly. "It would be like asking the sun to stop providing warmth." "Gertrude's strength is not separate from who she is, Amos. It is the very core of her character, and I fell in love with that core, not despite it." Amos nodded slowly, satisfaction evident in every line of his weathered face. "Then I believe my daughter has finally found the partner she always deserved, even if it took a wildfire and a hidden river to prove it to both of you." The newly married couple settled into a comfortable arrangement that honored both of their families' ranching legacies. Bernard's father, softened considerably by the events of that summer and increasingly aware of his own mortality, following a mild heart episode the following spring, gradually transferred greater responsibility for the Fairchild Ranch operations to his son, while Gertrude continued to manage significant portions of her own father's property, the two ranches operating in the kind of genuine, mutually beneficial partnership that Wallace and Amos had originally intended 20 years before their foolish pride had derailed that vision. Within the ranching community of the Texas Panhandle, Gertrude Bristol Fairchild became something of a legend. Her story of leading an entire cattle drive to safety through a hidden river during a raging wildfire told and retold at gatherings and dances throughout the region for years afterward. Young girls growing up on neighboring ranches would sometimes ask their fathers whether they too might learn to ride and rope as skillfully as the famous Gertrude Fairchild, and more than a few progressive-minded ranchers began allowing their own daughters greater latitude in learning practical frontier skills, citing Gertrude's extraordinary example as proof that a woman's capability need not be limited by conventional expectations. Bernard, for his part, never tired of telling the story of that terrifying night, always emphasizing with genuine humility how thoroughly Gertrude's skill and courage had exceeded anything he had believed possible, how his own initial assumptions about her capabilities had been proven not merely wrong but embarrassingly, fundamentally mistaken. "I have met few men in my life braver than my wife," he would tell anyone who asked about the scar on his forearm from a burning ember that had struck him during their desperate flight through the fire. "And I have met no one, man or woman, more capable of clear thinking under the most extreme pressure imaginable. She saved every single life on that drive, including my own, and she did it not through luck but through decades of hard-won knowledge that she had every right to be proud of." Their marriage produced 3 children over the following years, a firstborn son they named Amos after Gertrude's father, born in the autumn following their wedding, followed 2 years later by a daughter they named Sarah after Bernard's late mother, and finally, 4 years after that, a second son named Wallace after Bernard's father, who lived long enough to meet and dote upon his young grandson before passing peacefully in his sleep at the age of 63. Having witnessed the complete reconciliation of the two families, he had once nearly destroyed through his own foolish pride. Gertrude taught all 3 of her children to ride before they could properly walk, insisting that, regardless of gender, every child raised on frontier ranchland deserved to possess the practical skills that might one day save their own lives or the lives of others. Young Amos Fairchild grew into a capable rancher in his own right, eventually taking over management of the combined Fairchild-Bristol operations, while Sarah, much to her mother's evident pride, developed an even more prodigious talent for reading weather patterns and animal behavior than Gertrude herself had ever possessed, eventually becoming known throughout the region for her uncanny ability to predict dangerous conditions before they fully materialized. The hidden river itself, the secret passage that had saved an entire cattle drive from certain destruction, was never marked on any official map, remaining instead a piece of family lore passed down carefully from parent to child, a reminder of the night when courage, skill, and hard-won frontier knowledge had triumphed over both natural disaster and the accumulated weight of old family grievances. Years later, when Gertrude had grown into a respected matriarch of the combined ranching operation, with silver beginning to streak her once auburn hair and small lines of laughter and hard-won wisdom etched permanently around her eyes, she would sometimes ride out alone to that same hidden river, now grown somewhat wider and more visible following years of seasonal flooding, and remember the terror and triumph of that single desperate night that had changed the entire trajectory of her life. Bernard would occasionally join her on these quiet rides, and they would sit together on the riverbank in comfortable silence, watching the water flow steadily toward the horizon, 2 people who had built a genuine partnership of equals from the ashes of near catastrophe and decades of buried family secrets. "Do you ever regret it?" Bernard asked her once, many years after that terrible summer, as they watched their grandchildren playing in the shallow water where the herd had once splashed through in desperate flight from the flames. The danger, the fear, everything we survived to reach this moment. Gertrude considered the question seriously, as she considered all questions, with the same careful thoughtfulness she had once applied to reading cattle and predicting weather. "I regret the pain our fathers caused each other through their pride and silence," she said finally. "But the wildfire itself, the danger we faced together, the moment I finally understood that you could love my strength rather than fear it. No, Bernard, I regret none of that. That fire tested us, but it also revealed us, showed us exactly who we truly were and what we were truly capable of building together. I would not trade that revelation for a lifetime of easier, safer beginnings." Bernard reached over and took her weathered, capable hand in his own, the same hand that had once thrown a wild steer with expert precision, that had guided a mare through impossible brush toward salvation, that had raised 3 children with equal parts fierce love and practical wisdom. "I love you, Gertrude Fairchild," he said, the words as true and steady as they had been on that first day beside the hidden river, when ash still drifted through the air, and an entire cattle drive survival had rested upon this remarkable woman's shoulders. "I have loved you since the moment you led us to safety, and I will love you until the day I draw my final breath." "And I love you, Bernard Fairchild," she replied, leaning her head against his shoulder as the Texas sun set in brilliant orange and gold across the ranch land they had built together. 2 families finally united, 2 proud hearts finally at peace, one extraordinary woman finally recognized for exactly the remarkable person she had always been. "Now and always, my love, now and always." The sun continued its descent toward the western horizon, painting the hidden river in shades of amber and rose, and somewhere in the distance, cattle lowed contentedly in pastures made safe and prosperous through the combined wisdom of 2 families who had learned, through fire and flood, and finally through love, that true partnership required equal measures of strength, honesty, and the courage to trust completely in someone else's extraordinary capability. Their story, like the hidden river itself, would flow on through generations, a testament to a rancher's daughter who needed no rescuing, only recognition, and the rugged man wise enough to offer it freely, wholeheartedly, and forever.